Okay, now that we're recording, I think we'll go ahead and start. So everyone, welcome. Hello. Thank you very much for coming to our event this evening, Talking Tea. We're very excited to learn a little bit about green tea and the history of tea in Japan from an expert who's going to teach us all about that. But first, let me just briefly introduce myself. My name is Gabriel Riebeck. I'm Japan Programs Manager with Laurasian Institution. This event is being sponsored by Laurasian Institution. I'll tell you just a little bit more about who we are in a second, but let me first introduce our program director in our Tokyo office, Yume Hidaka.
Konnichiwa, minasan. Hello, everyone. I am connecting from Tokyo, 10 a.m. I hope you enjoy the event.
And Yume is the one who prepared our door prize, which is going to be a little bit of nice tea from Japan. So stick around to the end. You have to be present to receive the door prize when we pull the names at the end. So please stick around for that. And next, I'd like to introduce Samantha Corpus, who is with me in the Seattle Laurasian office. Samantha.
Hi everyone, thanks so much for joining. You'll see I'm talking through Patrick's computer. Can you hear me well?
Make sure they're not mentioning me because I know them.
A little bit.
See my name.
And I'm also hearing, I think Mike Penny.
Sorry.
Sorry, we're hearing somebody else in the chat right now, so we'll.
No worries.
Okay.
No worries. Program assistant at Laurasian Institution, and I'm very excited for us to give this presentation today. So thank you for joining this morning or this evening, wherever you are.
Thanks, Sam. Okay, so yeah, then without further ado, I'll introduce Laurasian, and then we can get on with our presentation today. So Laurasian Institution is a nonprofit group that specializes in programs of academic exchange, particularly between the US and Japan. If you're familiar with the JET program, which sends people to Japan to teach English, we have several major programs that are almost like a reverse JET program that dispatches Japanese nationals who are cultural or language experts to teach about Japan in the United States. We also run programs that send United States-based students over to Japan for educational programs and homestay programs, things like that. And increasingly, we're providing more programming such as this online educational events talking about Japanese language and culture and things like that. So please keep an eye out for these events in the future. We always love to have you join us. Yeah, that all having been said, this evening's expert to speak with us is named Patrick Penny. Pat started his career in Japan on the JET program in Gunma. He has spent the last decade of his life in pursuit of tea science and history, has studied under the tutelage of many tea masters and scholars in East Asia, and continues to leverage his passion as a senior product developer at Starbucks. If you've ever seen a little Starbucks drink at a konbini in Japan, Pat made that drink. He creates all of those. So we're all looking forward to hearing what Pat has to say about the history of tea in Japan. So everyone, please join me in welcoming Patrick Penny.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Gabe. So thank you for that wonderful intro. And today we're going to do a little bit of talking about tea. So I hope everyone either has a nice cup of tea with them today to drink while we're talking about it. Maybe for those of you in Japan, it's a little earlier in the morning, so it might be good timing. If anyone's joining us from the East Coast, it's never too late for tea. But yeah, hopefully you all have something that you can enjoy while I'm giving this presentation. So we'll go over to the next slide, and I'll tell you a little bit about why am I talking to you about tea. So I've been studying tea for about a decade at this point. Once I turned 40, I can say half my life. Right now, it's about a third of my life. But I was the co-founder and former executive director of the Tea Institute at Penn State. I did my undergraduate in food sciences, and I got to do some undergraduate research for a few years on polyphenol compounds in tea, how they were affected by the processing, specifically looking at Taiwanese oolong teas. And so a lot of my concentration in tea is in Chinese tea. However, I've done a lot of studying regarding the history, culture of other tea ceremonies as well. During my undergraduate studies, I was lucky enough to have opportunities to go to Japan, Korea, Taiwan, and then more recently China as well, to study under various tea teachers. Most of my studies are centered in Taiwan, but I've had the opportunity to go to tea farms in all of these countries, pick and process my own tea. And actually today, one of the teas that I'm drinking, although we're talking about Japanese tea, I will be drinking a Korean tea today that I made myself on a tea farm in Korea. So all that is to say, I love tea, and I just want to share my love of tea and passion for tea with anyone who will listen. So I'm glad you guys are all joining us today. I also have got to use a little bit of my passion for tea in my profession. So as Gabe was saying, currently I do work on these lovely little drinks for Japan. They're all coffee-based. But I've also done tea work for Starbucks as well. I did about 3 years of working in our manufacturing plants for tea. And I've also gone and traveled to Korea and China to start new tea blending facilities for Starbucks in those countries. So I've got to work with a lot of amazing professionals in the tea industry, you know, over just the past 10 years. And with all that said, let's kick into Japanese tea. So, you know, when we think about tea today in Japan, it looks very different than like what you see in front of me. Many of you have probably experienced something like a Japanese tea ceremony where you've gone, you know, to a very formal chakai where people were dressed in kimono. They were handling wares in very specific ways. There was specific set phrases that went back and forth while tea was being whisked, passed to you. Maybe you got to enjoy it, or maybe you've just seen like a YouTube video of it. But you know, all of that is rather recent. And by recent, I mean about the past 400 years. So long for all of our lifespans, but pretty recent. We're going to go back to basically the late Nara, early Heian period. And we're going to look at how tea came to Japan. And as I mentioned before, you know, I hope you're all drinking some tea. I'm also going to drink tea while I do this. Be a nice break so you don't have to hear my voice the whole time. You'll get to, you know, see me enjoy some tea. So as I said, I'm brewing a Korean tea right now. Hopefully you can kind of see my wares. So this isn't Japanese style tea brewing in any way, shape, or form. As I said, most of my concentration is in Chinese tea ceremony centered around Taiwan. But the principles for brewing tea are pretty universal between the tea cultures. So I'm using some Korean tea wares as well as some Chinese or Japanese tea cups. This is some antique Arita cups. My wastewater bowl is also a Raku Chawan that I got to make myself with Nakamura Donen, which is the current grandmaster who's making bowls for the Omotesenge family. So my bowl looks nowhere near as good as his bowls, but it was very fun to work with him. So I'm just gonna go ahead and brew a little bit of tea now. We did get some questions from people prior to this event, so I'll try and answer those at the end. But if you have any questions while I'm going through this presentation, while you see any of these slides or hear anything I say, please go ahead and put it in the chat or write it down for later. We'll definitely have time to go over it, and we'll have one from Laurasian monitoring the chat to make sure we don't lose too many questions in the meantime. So getting to this slide, tea originates in China. You know, tea itself doesn't pay attention to any geopolitical land borders, but what is now about Yunnan province, somewhere between Burma and Laos in southwest China, is what's thought to be the birthplace of tea. There's still some debate on that to this day, but I'd say about 90% of experts believe that tea is coming from southwest China originally. We have something else that's coming from India moving its way through southwest China, and that's Buddhism. So in the Chinese dynasty, the Tong Dynasty, we have this craze for Buddhism start spreading. The reason for that is that prior to this dynasty, there was a lot of disrest in the country. There was a lot of civil wars, rebellions. If anyone's heard of like the Yellow Turban Rebellion, that's happening right before the Tong Dynasty in China. And so basically you have a lot of people really suffering. Life is very hard in basically like the Sui and like late Han Dynasty China, right before the Tong. Life is really hard, and there's a lot of suffering. And what more fertile ground is there to spread a new religion than a time when a lot of people are suffering? So Buddhism promises, right, a release from this earthly suffering. And so it really becomes very popular in China. And since it's spreading from basically India through China, it starts in the southwest and it makes its way up northeast. During this time in the Tang Dynasty, the basically imperial family is centered in Xi'an, which is basically, I would say, northern central China. And so Buddhism moves from southwestern China, where these tea growing regions are, and it moves up through towards the northeast. With it comes tea. And so with that spread of Buddhism throughout Japan, or throughout China, we start to have tea introduced to Japan through really this spread. So we have two guys, really cool looking monks. You can see them on the pictures in this slide. I'm rocking one of their hairstyles actually right now. But we have these guys, Saito and Kukai. So Kukai is the founder of Shingon Buddhism. It's one of the, I'd say, three major branches of Buddhism. Maybe if you've had a chance to travel to Japan, maybe you've been to a place called Koyasan in Wakayama. It's a very spiritual place, a very holy place for Buddhists. And so that's actually where his mausoleum is, but he's the founder of Shingon Buddhism. And then we also have a guy, Saito, and Saito founds Tendai Buddhism. The line through my entire presentation that we're going to talk about today really starts with this guy, Saito. And so both of them are sent by the Nara Emperor, the Saga Emperor in the early Heian period, about 805, 806. They're sent to China to study Buddhism. And so I'm just going to pass off a little bit of tea here. And Sam is helping me out today. So I've got two cups in front of me. She's enjoying one of them. So Saito and Kukai travel, actually the year was 804. They travel to China to go study Buddhism under various teachers in China. And they both return basically within about a year, 2 years. And Sam, you can go to the next slide. So we have Saito actually returning first in 805. Supposedly he brings back tea seeds and plants them at Mount Hiei in Kyoto. But this isn't well documented. We don't actually have any historical records to document this. It's basically a hearsay at this point. Kukai returns 1 year after that, so 806, and he brings back various Buddhist items, equipment, instruments that you would have found at a monastery or experienced in daily Buddhist life at this time. And part of that actually is that he brings back tea seeds and he brings back a stone mill for grinding the tea. And this is actually really well documented in the third volume of Nihon Koki. And so the Nihon Koki is a imperially commissioned historical text. And so, this provides us a great record of where we believe tea is first introduced to Japan. And so, wow, like 1200 years ago, it's pretty crazy. The tea that we're talking about at this time doesn't look anything like what I'm brewing today, these loose leaf tea leaves. And it doesn't look anything like the matcha we think about either, that's commonly consumed in Japanese tea ceremony. What they would have been drinking would have been the Chinese Tong Dynasty preparation of tea. What that was tea leaves would be picked from the bush. They would be blanched, so basically dipped into boiling water. They would be ground into a paste, pressed into a mold, basically heated or baked over a fire. And then that would just give you basically a brick or a cake of tea. Similar to, if anyone's seen pu'er tea, it would look like that. It would taste nothing like that. The preparation is very different. But then to actually drink that tea, this Tong Dynasty style tea, you'd have to break off a piece of this cake. You'd have to grind it in basically like a planar grind. And I'll actually show some pictures of this grinder later on in the presentation. And then you would take what is basically a very rough powder. So nowhere near as fine as matcha is today. But you take that rough powder and you would put that in boiling water. It would foam up a lot. You would add a little bit of cool water to settle the foam. And then you would draw some of that basically boiled tea off into a bowl. And if you were someone who is really fancy from higher nobility, you would, probably draw into a larger bowl, and then from there that would be put down at a table with a bunch of nobles, and be scooped into even smaller bowls from there. And so this tea and this tea ceremony, this Tong Dynasty tea ceremony that was brought back to Japan through Buddhism, really is only introduced to the nobility in Japan. And so we can kind of see with the next text that I have here, we do have a lot of monks traveling to China at this time. Another one, Eichu, is said at this time to have brewed tea for the Saga Emperor. And so the court is kind of interested in this tea ceremony. They're interested in Chinese wares, and they're interested in, the ceremonies surrounding Buddhism. And so, this Tang Dynasty preparation of tea lasts in the Heian court for probably about 50 to 100 years, but it never really goes anywhere. And so that's why probably, when we see Japanese tea ceremony today, it looks nothing like what I just described, right? Because it really didn't survive. It didn't get spread to the common people. It was only really the highest level of nobility that was practicing this. And Sam, you can go to the next slide. And so that Tong preparation of tea dies out in Japan. We have about 400 years later, another monk by the name of Eisai of the Tendai school. And so this is that lineage I was talking about. This is not a direct student, but a student of Saicho's down the line. He goes to China in 1187, and he studies Buddhism and brings back what will later become Rinzai Buddhism, the Rinzai sect. And maybe that one sounds a little more familiar. That is what we refer to as Zen Buddhism. He also brings back tea seeds, which are planted out at Mount Sephiri, and he gives tea seeds to a monk who belongs to this temple called Kosanji. It's still actually in Kyoto today, just basically really in the Uji area. And that monk, Myoe Shonin, plants these seeds, and this becomes the first documented site that tea seeds were planted in Japan. So really this goes to show us that tea is rather new in the scope of all things to Japan. It's believed to have been in China for about 4,000 or 5,000 years. Really, it's only been in Japan for about 800 years. This guy, Eisai, also writes a book called the Kisa Yojoki. In that book, he basically details why you should drink tea, right? So he tells people that it's healthy. He tells them the ways to prepare it, what it can kind of cure. So I think we see some of this today in a lot of marketing, right? From companies kind of like my own, like Tivana. You see a lot of this health marketing, right? So this was kind of a book talking about the healthy properties of tea. And because of this book, actually, brewing tea and tea in general became a lot more popular in Japan. So now it wasn't just the monks that were brewing it and not just the nobility, but you also have the merchant class who gets really interested in tea. And so they start to kind of buy it, get interested in the wares, the practice, and selling it. So this is where we really see tea spread in Japan. And this would have been the Song Chinese style of brewing tea, which looks a little bit more like today's Japanese tea ceremony that we're familiar with. And you can go to the next slide, Sam. And so here we have some of the wares that I was mentioning earlier. These are the Tong Dynasty Chinese tea brewing wares that would have been shown to the Saga Emperor introducing tea from China to Japan originally. And the reason I wanted to show this was this tea grinder that's kind of in the middle of the slide. This gives you a good idea of how that tea was ground in the day, and it doesn't really look so different in the Song Dynasty either. This is a particularly nice grinder. It's gold and silver. This would have been for the Tong Emperor. And this was actually found in 1985 in Xi'an, China. It's part of the Famen temple excavation. With this, they also found a finger bone of the Buddha, Siddhartha Gautama. So it's a very interesting excavation. Some of it is still on display if you go to Xi'an in their museum. But I just wanted to show you this so you can get an idea of how different these wares were at the time, how this is so different than what we think of as tea today. These were just some of the implements you needed to prepare the Tong Chinese style of tea. So obviously you need a lot to make it. This was here we have 7 wares. you needed 22 separate wares to prepare tea correctly in the Tong style. And that can probably show you why it didn't become popular with regular people. You just needed so much capital, so many wares to really even be able to make the tea properly. With the Song Dynasty style of tea that spreads from China to Japan, a lot of those wares are reduced. So you don't need 22 elaborate gold inlaid wares anymore to brew. And that's why, that's another reason for why we start to see tea spread and become more popular with merchants and warriors as well. So some of the lower castes below your, nobility. You can go to the next slide, Sam. And here I want to show, this is one of the most pivotal tea wares for the Song Dynasty style of brewing tea, which became popular in the late Heian, I would say early Kamakura period of Japan. So this is in Chinese called Jianyao, Jianyao Bowl. In Japanese, we refer to this as tenmoku. So maybe that's a phrase that's more familiar with Japanese tea practitioners. Maybe you've heard about these kind of bowls. This one is specifically from China. It is from the Song Dynasty. However, it is in Japan. And it's a couple $1 million bowl. We could play like Who Wants to Be a Millionaire with this bowl. So a bowl that I'd love to get my hands on one day, but probably will never happen. But this is an example of the wares that would have been popular with the people practicing tea in Japan in the Kamakura period, so around the 12 and 1300s. And this is kind of what was the aesthetic that was appreciated at the time. So even though Japan was starting to make its own wares, people practicing tea in Japan at this time really were extremely interested in Chinese wares. There's even for it, karamono, which refers to basically these really beautiful wares coming from China that were thought to, really they were a way to show your wealth because they cost a lot of money to get these. It had to be imported into Japan, and it just showed how influential you were. And so this early tea ceremony and around the Kamakura era would have probably actually been really gaudy. Would have been people showing off a lot of these luxurious wares that they got from China, showing how influential they were. And even with a lot of the kind of warlords of the time, your prowess in tea ceremony, the practitioners you kept company with, and the wares you had just showed how much power you had. And so I wanted to show you these bowls in particular because they were really pivotal to the time. And you can see that a lot of teaware or tea bowls, chawan today, are still shaped pretty similarly. And so this is a shape dating back to about actually the 900s in China, in the Song Dynasty. And if you go to the next slide, I'll show you even more beautiful ones. So these are Yohen Tenmoku. Basically translates to like glorious, shining heaven's eye bowl. So Tenmoku means like heaven's eye. There are only 3 intact ones in existence, and you can see very sadly in the bottom left of the slide, a broken one. So the broken one is on display in a museum in Hangzhou in China. The other 3 pretty consistently rotate throughout museums in Japan. So for those of you in Japan right now, I think you can go see, I believe one of them is on display in one of the museums in Osaka. I think another one is on display in the Ueno Arts Museum. I don't know which one is on display where, but I got to see it in 2012. Very beautiful bowls. The reason I want to show you this still is just to kind of show you really how like elaborate and lavish the wares looked at the time, what was popular or what was the aesthetic that people appreciated in this Kamakura era of tea practitioners. And another thing I find really interesting about it is, of course, since these are so beautiful and fabulous and desired really by tea practitioners, they were really heavily faked as well. So if we go to the next slide, this is just one of the interesting ways that I think we can kind of relate to this talk of really early tea ceremony to the modern era. So we had what was supposedly a Yohen Tenmoku bowl show up on Nandemo Kanteidan. So that's like Japan's version of Antiques Roadshow, for those of you who haven't watched it, where people basically will bring items that maybe they got from like a grandparent, or that has been in their family for generations, they'll bring it and they'll show it to the appraisers on this show. And the appraisers in the show will like tell them, oh, wow, you have this amazing treasure and it's worth so much money. Or they'll say, hey, this is a forgery. There was an interesting case, I think this was in 2015, where a guy who runs a ramen shop brought a bowl in that, he said he got from his great grandfather. He said he knows his family has had it since, before the 20th century. He knows it's been in the family for a while. He brings it in, and it's the bowl. If we're looking at the picture on the right, it's the right side of that photo. The left side of that photo is a real Yohen Tenmoku bowl, which I showed you in the previous slide. And the appraiser on this show said, when looking at the far right picture, he said, this is a real Yohen Tenmoku bowl. And I think the picture shows pretty well, but it's not. There was a lot of ways to prove it, actually. In the bottom left of the slide, we see the chop, basically the bottom marking on the bowl. Almost all teaware have a chop somewhere, either on the bottom or on the side, basically anywhere but the face of the bowl, anywhere aside from where the main decoration is. And on the right side, we can see, on the right side of the bottom left photo, we can see what was on the fake bowl. And on the left side, we see a real Yohen Tenmoku bowl's chop. They might look pretty similar from here, but we know that the Song Dynasty Chinese Emperor Song Huizhong really preferred thin calligraphy. His own handwriting style was extremely thin, and that's what was really preferred throughout the entire Song Dynasty when a lot of these bowls were made. Additionally, the stroke order between the two bowls, the left and the right, for people who are very proficient at looking at stroke order of characters, we can see that the stroke order of the one on the left is more like the Chinese stroke order for these characters. It says Gongyu in Chinese, which means like a tribute or for the emperor. The one on the right has very thick characters, and the stroke order is actually a Japanese stroke order for these characters. That's one way we could tell the bowl is fake. I think maybe even for everyone looking at this, if you see the picture, you might just go, wow, these are totally different bowls. There's actually a potter right now who's been in a family in Seto for about 6 generations who's recreating the Yohen Tenmoku glaze. But basically this glaze was lost to time after the Song Dynasty in China. It hasn't really been recreated. We can see the bowl on the far right picture, the fake bowl, is a totally different glaze. It's a spinel glaze from the 18th century in Europe. And so I just thought this was a fun thing to show, how rare these bowls are nowadays, how coveted they are, and, how bad the fakes can be, even though they sometimes fool the appraisers. So I thought this was just kind of a funny, more modern day reference to the tea ceremony of the time. So we'll go to the next slide and we'll kind of talk a little bit more about how that tea, that Song Dynasty Chinese tea preparation, becomes the modern day Japanese tea ceremony. Because when we see this bowl, the Yohen Tenmoku bowl, and we see that grinder on the screen, these are things we don't really see so much in modern day Japanese tea ceremony. The grinder is totally different. Generally, a lot of the bowls that are used are a lot more understated. So this aesthetic basically totally disappears. So we have 3 really important figures, basically from the Kamakura era all the way up through the Azuchi Momoyama period, basically coming to the Edo period, where we start to see what is our modern Chanayu. 3 main characters really showing up here: Morata Juko, Take no Jo, and one that maybe you've all heard, Senoriku. And so these guys play a really pivotal role in developing that Chinese Song Dynasty tea ceremony and turning it into what is now the Japanese tea ceremony. So the first one, and those 3 are in chronological order. So the first one, Morata Juko, he is a Rinzai sect monk. And so that's tying back to Eisai and Saicho, the guys I told you about in the beginning. So he's a monk practicing Zen Buddhism. And he's really influenced by Buddhism, and he introduces this concept of wabi-cha into his tea practice. And what that concept really is that, hey, these really shiny Yohen Tenmoku bowls, they seem really out of place. And, we have gold natsume or tea caddies, and we've got all these really rare and elaborate wares we're using to prepare tea. And it feels really out of order with the spirit of the tea ceremony. And so he starts introducing more rustic wares into the tea ceremony. And not only that, he starts introducing a lot of Japanese wares into the tea ceremony. So as I mentioned, a lot of people at the time were really, really caught up on Chinese wares. And so Morata Juko says, well, if we have this beautiful Yohen Tenmoku bowl, it would look even better juxtaposed by a rustic Japanese bamboo scoop. And so we start to see kind of this aesthetic lean towards more rustic items, things that are a little more worn or withered. It doesn't have to be shiny and sparkly anymore. This is a very small group of people with Juko who are following this ideal. It's definitely not the majority of tea practitioners of the time. People are still really trying to show off their tea wares for sure at this time. His Buddhist aesthetic is also really showed through the saying, Zen and tea are one taste. This becomes a very famous saying in tea, and basically all of the Iemoto or grandmasters of all of the Sansenkei, the three main teachings, the three main groups of Chanoyo classes today. This phrase, Zen and tea are one taste, is really still prevalent through this day. And it just shows how much Buddhism has shaped not just tea in Japan, but Chanoyu, the Japanese tea ceremony. Just to kind of tell you why Morata Juko is so important, it's very obvious, even from our records, that he was one of the best tea practitioners of his day. The reason for that is he was employed by someone really important. So the shogun at this time, Ashikage Yoshimasa, employed him. And what that basically meant is if you had a really famous patron, shogun or daimyo, it meant that your skill and your ideals or thoughts about tea ceremony were very highly valued. So beyond, the class that you belong to, you were thought to be, someone whose thoughts were so important that you could have the company of this really important person. Something crazy at the time that Juko introduces to tea ceremony, and that definitely still, I think, is even more relevant today, he introduces this idea that when you enter the tea space, everyone is equal. So he creates the crawling entrance for the tea room. It's called a nijiri guchi, and I'll have pictures of it later. But basically, it's an entrance to the tea room where you have to get on your knees and actually crawl into the tea space. So this is invented around his time. And the idea is that everyone must bow their head to enter the tea space. So it doesn't matter if you're the shogun, his patron, or, if you're just a merchant, or not that tea was popular with farmers, but even if you were a farmer, right, you were equal once you entered this tea room. And so this idea is of course passed on to his next student as well, Takenojo. Another thing that he does is tea rooms at the time were really large. So if you think of a tea space today, you're probably thinking of like a 8.5 tatami room mat. It's not so big. They used to be up to 32 tatami mat rooms, which are huge. It's really more of like a festival or a gathering at that point, and not the intimate tea gathering that we know today. So he reduced the size of the tea room, basically cuts it in half. And you can go on to the next slide, Sam. And so, on the last slide, I had that Yohen Tenmoku bowl, the really sparkly bowl with like the silver inlaid rim. Here we start to see some tea wares that maybe look a little more familiar to modern day Chanoyu practitioners. So Takenojo takes Morata Juko's teaching of wabi-cha to the next level. Basically, wabi-sabi, which maybe you've heard of the term, it's basically an aesthetic ideal that, things should be valued for their impermanence. Maybe they've been worn down by time, maybe they were broken a little bit, but that doesn't mean that they're not special in their own way. And so Takenojo really starts to flesh out this concept of wabi-sabi. The words actually didn't exist at that time, the word wabi-sabi, but he writes a lot of letters on the concept, kind of creating it. And he really infuses that into his tea ceremony. Buddhism, of course, is also infused into his tea ceremony, but he starts to incorporate other Japanese arts. So he's really influenced by No, and he's really influenced by Renga, which is like a style of Japanese poetry. He even studies under quite a famous poet at the time, Sanjunishi Sanetaka. And so we start to see a lot of poetry and other Japanese arts infuse what was just previously a much more Chinese tea brewing method, tea preparation. And so this is where we really start to see it become Japanese, where we really start to see Japanese culture bleed into what was the tea at the time. And so, not just refining the idea of wabi-sabi, he really drives even more towards Japanese wares. So Take no Jo really starts to prefer the kind of wares we see in this screen. So at the bottom, we have a Zen Bowl. And so this is a really rustic, earthy tone, probably looking totally different, right, than those shiny bowls I showed you before. And then in the top of the picture too is a Seto bowl that's actually been broken and repaired by kintsugi. And so I think kintsugi has become kind of popular in the last couple of years, like the last decade, you've probably heard the term. But what it is you use lacquer and some gold dust basically to fix a broken object. And what that's saying is that, that broken object is still valuable. And actually, it's even more valuable. You use gold now to fix it. And so kintsugi and some of these other aesthetics start to become even more popular with Take no Jo. He really infuses these into his tea ceremony. He also takes that, reduced room size that Morata Juko popularizes, and he reduces it even more. He's like, this is too much of a party. There's still too many people here having way too much fun. This should be a little more serious. Maybe his Buddhism kind of, infusing it. But he thinks that it should be an even more intimate, small gathering of people. And you can go on to the next slide, Sam. So these are wares that are popular nowadays, but this is a little bit of what I was talking about with the wabi-sabi aesthetic. So with Take no Jo, we start to see bowls like Raku become popular. So on the right, we have a black Kudo Raku bowl. And, it is rather understated. The shape, right? The lines aren't perfect. There's a very roughness, almost like it looks like, someone wasn't trying to make it like a perfect shape. You can see maybe where some finger indents are in the bowl. But what makes it really beautiful is that slight gold. And it's just, the color of the glaze on the clay, actually, it's not real gold. But that slight gold color bleeding through the black is something that makes the bowl really beautiful. And also your tea at the time, is something kind of like a proto matcha. It wasn't quite as green as the matcha we drink today, not that vibrant, beautiful color because the processing was still a little crude. But in Take no Jo's time, that whisked tea that he'd be preparing would look, really beautiful and stark against this black background, this black bowl, especially in comparison to maybe that really shiny bowl I showed you in the other page. And I actually am just realizing now, but I forgot to mention that basically, the tea at this time, moving from Song Dynasty China and what has become now the kind of Kamakura era tea preparation of Morata, Juko, and Take no Jo at this time, had changed from that Tong Dynasty style tea that I had mentioned earlier, where the tea, after being ground, was no longer boiled in water. So the tea, being ground into a powder, would now be put into these tea bowls and actually whisked. So still, the preparation method looked quite different than what we think of as modern day chanoyu. But by this time, Take no Jo's time, it was getting very close. And so I'm just going to talk about the other two bowls really quick as well. In the upper left-hand corner, we have an Onihogi Bowl. And so it looks really beautiful, kind of really thick, globulous glaze. Looks almost like snow has kind of like settled on the bowl. It's very natural, and you can see the clay underneath showing through. And then in the bottom left, we have a Shigaraki Chawan, so a bowl from Shigaraki. And this is also very earthy in tone. So, comparing I like to show you those Yohen Tenmoku bowls earlier because I think they're a great juxtaposition to what we're seeing now. These really rough hewn shapes, and especially that Shigaraki looks like someone just kind of took it out of the ground, right? So earthy in color. But this is what's starting to become popular with tea practitioners like Morata Juko, and especially Takenojo, really starts suffusing his tea ceremony with this wabi-sabi aesthetic. And you can go on to the next slide, Sam. And so here we have the figure that you've probably all heard of. So here we have Senoriku, and he is a direct student of Takenojo. So Rikyu at a young age, studies Rinzai Buddhism, and he studies with some famous tea practitioners, like I mentioned, Takenojo. He originally starts studying with a different student of Takenojo's, but eventually studies directly under him. And the reason that we've probably all heard of Senoriku, the reason why he's so important, is because the tea ceremony that he codifies, basically by the end of his life, really the late 1500s, is almost exactly step for step what you would see today if you would attend an Emote Senke or Ura Senke or Mushinakoji Senke tea ceremony. So one of the really cool things about Japanese tea ceremony is that after Senoriku basically perfects it, the Iemoto, so basically the Grand Master of each school or class of tea ceremony, is only actually able to make one change in their lifetime to the codified tea ceremony that was basically created by Senoriku. So between, I just keep mentioning the big three. They're called the San Senke, which is Amote, Ura, and Mushinakoji Senke. Between the three of them, there are some differences in the way that the tea ceremony is done. So like Amote Senke and Ura Senke, a really easy one to think of is when you're handed the bowl in Amote Senke Chanoyu, you'll often rotate the bowl clockwise after receiving it. In Ura Senke, you might go counterclockwise. In Mushinakoji, it might be handed to you slightly off kilter, maybe 45-degree angle versus directly to the face of the bowl. So there's some slight differences in all of them, but the real big changes in them have only been made by the Grand Masters and really all date back to Sennoriku's tea ceremony. And this picture that I have this is actually a picture I took at Daitokuji. It's a pretty important temple in Kyoto where Senoriku did a lot of his studying. One of the ways that we can recognize how important he was to tea ceremony, to Japanese tea ceremony, was by who was his patron, right? So he was employed by many daimyos. So Oda Nobunaga employs him, as well as Toyotomi Hideyoshi. So these are basically the two most important daimyos coming through the Sengoku Jidai, Sengoku period, basically leading up to what is the Edo period in the 1600s. And as I kind of had mentioned before, in the Kamakura era, so when tea is really becoming popular with merchants and other classes, that kind of gaudy tea ceremony where we're showing off the wares was really big. And it is still big with this warrior class. So the daimyos and the shoguns, they're still showing off these beautiful bowls, elaborate Chinese wares, even though they're employing people like Senoriku who are showing really understated wares and are really into this wabi-sabi tea aesthetic. And you can go on to the next slide, Sam. And I love this kettle that I put in the background here. So this is like the translation of the name is basically flat spider, is the name of this tetsubin or kettle in the background. This kettle has a really cool story without going into like too many of the years or the names around it. Basically, one of the enemies of Oda Nobunaga had this kettle and he showed it off in all of his tea ceremonies. And Oda Nobunaga eventually decides, all right, I'm going to invade this guy's castle. And the two things that like Oda Nobunaga really wants are one, his head, and two, his kettle. So he wants to be the one that kills him or decapitates him, and he wants to take his kettle so that he can use it in his tea ceremony. And supposedly the guy, I just remember his last name is Hisahide. I don't remember his first name. But there's a lot of myths around what he did. But supposedly he fills the kettle with gunpowder and blows it up and blows himself up with it. So Oda Nobunaga can't kill him and he can't have the kettle. So there's a lot of stories like that with, daimyo or shogun and tea equipment. It's kind of funny. You have these guys like waging war across the country, but a lot of what they're focusing on, aside from land and warriors, is tea equipment. So tea equipment at this time, if you were a general, you would have wanted to actually be awarded for your services in battle with tea equipment. You had people who would turn down land and castles because they would prefer to get a very rare bowl or a rare tea scoop. So I'm just trying to kind of elaborate to you guys how important tea ceremony still is and how influential it is at this time, where you have, really high warriors who want teaware. They want to be at the tea table. And so Oda Nobunaga eventually is actually the one who orders Senoriku to kill himself by seppuku. There's a couple really interesting stories between them, but basically their relationship eventually sours and Senoriku is forced to commit ritual suicide. One of the interesting stories that kind of sticks with me, and I think that really talks about the aesthetic that Senoriku had cultivated, was one day Oda Nobunaga is, basically parading through town, and he hears, from some local merchants that Rikyu had the most beautiful morning glories planted in his garden. And Oda Nobunaga is like, I love morning glories. Often he would travel to see flowers, which just tells you a little bit about, the Bushido and cultivating things like enjoying flowers and tea ceremony while also being like a warlord. So I think that's kind of interesting. But he says, okay, well, I'm going to show up to Senoriku's garden. I'm going to go see his morning glories that are supposedly so beautiful. So he goes to Senoriku's garden, and this is really important. It's like the daimyo or the shogun paying you a visit. So you should be prepared, right? And so Senoriku is prepared. He heard that Oda Nobunaga's coming. He cuts all of the flowers down. And this is like a man who's playing with life and death here. Like Oda Nobunaga eventually does have him killed, but at this point he could have him killed. And so Oda Nobunaga's furious. He storms basically into the tea room where he sees in the alcove, it's called a tokonoma, he sees one morning glory, one perfect morning glory, basically set up with like ikebana, the Japanese style of flower arrangement. And he's no longer angry. He kind of sees what Senoriku was doing. And I think this is a nice parable that kind of talks about this wabi-sabi aesthetic and how well Senoriku cultivated it. It's not about this massive, field of morning glories. It's about that one perfect morning glory. It's not about, that beautiful shining bowl. It's about a nice bowl, being maybe put next to a more rustic scoop so that the nice bowl looks even nicer. There's a phrase basically, and I'm paraphrasing it, but the most beautiful horse won't look amazing next to a golden castle, but that horse will look really amazing next to a shed. And that's paraphrasing, but a phrase that Senoriku had at the time as well. And so he basically still to this day is the most important figure for Chanoyu. And one of the really big reasons for that, other than him making all these steps and codifying the actions for the ceremony, is his grandchildren. So he has 3 grandchildren: Sen Sosa, Sen Soshu, and Sen Soshitsu. And so Sen Sosa creates Omote Senke. Sen Soshu creates Mushina Koji Senke, and Sen Soshitsu creates Ura Senke. And so I've mentioned these a couple times before, but they are the 3 biggest schools of tea ceremony. Ura Senke is the biggest in the world. They have a couple million students globally. They're pretty huge. Omote Senke is the biggest in Japan. So they're the most important in Japan. And the reason for that is the oldest child, the oldest grandchild, Sen Sosa, is the creator, but also he inherited the front of Senoriku's estate. And that's why they're called Omote Senke. Sen Soshitsu inherits the back, and that's why they're called Ura Senke. And Sen Soshu inherits the side next to Mushina Koji Street. And that's where all the names for the tea schools come from. And so I think really the most famous one still to this day is the master Sen Soshitsu. He wrote some amazing books, and his teachings are still really well preserved and translated actually into English. So if you're interested in any further reading, there's some translated books from Not him, but actually one of his successors, Sen Soshitsu the 18th, that I would recommend. We'll move on to the next slide. So basically, here I just wanted to show you, this is actually in Kyoto, this is the Omotesenke property. So I visited there in 2012, and I just wanted to show you some pictures of what it looks like when you approach as you enter some of the tea rooms. So this is really basically coming through the main gate. Now you're entering the actual garden, which you'll walk through to get to some of the tea rooms. And so this is in Kyoto, but it looks like you're in the middle of nowhere. It looks like you're in like a forest or a field. It's really, really beautiful, and it has a very strong kind of spiritual presence to it. And we can move through the slides pretty quickly. I just wanted to show some pictures of it. So here, actually going to one of the really famous tea rooms, Zangetsujan or Zangetsute, there is basically a Njiriguchi, so that crawling entrance, but it's not actually to get into the tea room. It's just to continue in the property. So this means that people like Oda Nobunaga, right, shoguns or daimyos, just to enter the property further, they were going to have to bow their head. And so that was a huge thing. And actually, supposedly, what I was told by the guide when we were going through here is that the shogun would actually just walk to the left and he would walk around it. So he would get by this one, but most other people wouldn't get by it. So this is just another garden leading to Fushin-an, which is Sennoriku's most famous tea room that he created. It's basically his magnum opus. But I just took a picture of this because I thought it was absolutely beautiful, really stunning, tranquil place. And you know, the idea when you're walking through this garden is that you're supposed to be washing kind of the dust of the world off of you. It's a very Buddhist idea, but basically what it is that your earthly worries, the kind of things you're attached to on a day-to-day basis, as you're walking through this, you should be forgetting about them, right? And I think we could all use a walk through this garden right now with everything going on in the year. But it really is a very spiritual place that has a very strong feeling to it. And as you walk through, you are centered a little bit. Your mind is calmed down. We'll go on to the next slide too. I think we'll get to some of the tea rooms. So I wanted to show you the Nijiriguchi. This is actually leaving the tea room, but you'd have to crawl in obviously to come into it. And you can just see how short it is. So that's my friend going through it right now, and he's about 5'7", not super tall, right? But you got to bend all the way down to get through. And then the man behind him is my friend, Mr. Koike, and he's also relatively short, but you can see just how short that entrance is. And another thing I really like to show is just how dark these tea rooms are. So some modern day tea rooms will have some lighting in them, but at this time it was really all about the natural light. And the shadows that were cast in the tea room were a big part of this wabi aesthetic. So the way that the shadows move or the way the natural light comes through and shines on the tea wares was very important. And there's a really great book written called In Praise of Shadow that talks a lot about shadows and their effect on basically the Japanese aesthetic or Japanese culture as well. It's a really short book. I definitely recommend it. It's only like 100 pages. But a good dive into Japanese aesthetic ideology. And we can go on to the next slide here. This is a picture inside Fushin-an. Please excuse the flash photography from like a Nikon from 2011. So you can see just how small this tea room is. This tea room was basically considered the greatest tea room created by Senoriku. It is 2 1/2, maybe 3/4 tatami mats in size. The space that you see in the back, that alcove, is where the actual practitioner would have made the tea and they have a small shelf above them as well that they can use as basically their mizuya, their preparation area. The mizuya is usually another completely different room, but this is so small that it's just one little shelf that you'd be using as your preparation space. And so I think I really like showing this because you can just see, one, how dark it is. There's a couple screens, but I mean, I really had to use a flash or you would have seen nothing in here. And this was midday that I took this photo. But just to see how small, how cramped, and to compare that to what I was saying before, we had like 32 tatami mat rooms. that these tea ceremonies were being held in just a few hundred years before this. And so we go from something that was really celebratory, almost like a festival atmosphere or a banquet, and it becomes, through Buddhism, through the influence of Renga, No, many other Japanese arts, it becomes something that's much more spiritual in focus and much less about, drinking the tea, less about talking to people. It becomes really about the connection between you, the host, and the guests that would be joining you. And really through Sennoriku's Chanayu, he coined the phrase ichigo ichie, meaning one meeting, one moment to one time, right? So basically that, if you went into this tea room with Senoriku, it would be you and maybe two other people at most, and it would be a really intimate gathering. And even, if you did it a day later or you did it again another time, something would be different. So even just like this meeting we're having now, right? This can only happen once. Maybe the next time, if I had a talking tea event, maybe different people would join, maybe it'd be a different topic, right? So something will be different. And that's really what Ichigo Ichie captures. And that's really the spirit of Chanayu, or Japanese tea ceremony, cultivated by those three men, Morata, Juko, Takenojo, and then finally Senoriku. And we can go on, I think, to the next slide. Okay. So I wanted to talk a little bit about, how that historical tea and how tea coming from China through Japan leads to the teas that we drink today. So we're going to go through 500 years really quick. So basically, when we go back to about the 1500s, this tea was very crude, it was very rough. As I mentioned, it might be kind of ground into a powder and drank something like the matcha of today, but they really didn't have good control over a lot of the processing methods, including control over oxidation. Oxidation is basically what separates green tea from a lot of other teas, to overgeneralize it. And so it really wasn't until the late 1500s that shading cultivation comes about. And what shading does when you're making matcha, if you shade the tea plants, you're going to reduce the amount of catechins that are created. These are polyphenol compounds that have a really strong astringency. So if you reduce this biting, bitterness, or astringency, you're going to increase the sweetness. Something else that was increased by this shading is L-theanine. L-theanine is an amino acid, but it's basically responsible for kind of the umami or rich taste in some Japanese teas, particularly gyokuro, as well as some matchas are really rich in flavor. But basically, after this shading cultivation comes about, tea becomes much more refined, especially matcha. But this technology is kept in one area, Uji or Uji Tawara as well. And this is basically the only area where that shaded cultivation is allowed to happen. And you can move on to the next slide. So outside of Uji or Uji Tawara, a lot of the tea was still extremely rough. And what people would have been drinking on a daily basis, like the normal people who aren't practicing tea ceremony, they would have been drinking something like a really bad bancha. It would have been really roughly fired. It would have been picked from very late pickings. And it's not actually until about 150, almost 200 years later, in 1738, this guy Nagatani Soen comes up with the method that's still used today to make sencha. So really, it's relatively new in the scale of tea in Japan or tea in general. Sencha, which is the most popularly drank green tea in Japan, is only a little over 250 years old. And so this technique nowadays is called Aose Sencha Seiho, basically just the way to make green Japanese tea. But there was a lot of steps that had to be combined, refined. It took Nagatani Soen about 30 years to come up with this technique to make normal tea that wasn't shaded taste good. But because he lived actually in Uji Tawara, the tea that was mostly sold there was the powdered matcha, and the people in that area didn't want to buy like loose leaf, non-ground tea. Most of the people in that area were practicing tea ceremony. They weren't average people. So he actually travels all the way to Tokyo, Edo at the time, and Yamamoto Kahe of Yamamoto-ya, which is still a pretty famous, not just tea shop, but a pretty famous Japanese merchant, decided to buy his tea and started selling it as something called tenkaichi, basically number one under heaven. And it's only from then that sencha becomes popular. It became so popular, actually, so quick after it was being sold by Yamamoto Kahei, that he actually, Yamamoto Kahei, would send money to Nagatani Soen and his family for the next 100 years because it made their brand so popular. It actually probably made their brand strong enough to survive till today. It is still around. And you can move on to the next slide. And so, with sencha coming up, we eventually have the emergence of gyokuro. Gyokuro is applying that shading technique that I talked about before, which is used for matcha, and it applies that technique to the growing of sencha. So about 2 to 4 weeks before you would pick the tea to make sencha, you shade it. Nowadays, we use that basically what is a black cheesecloth. It's basically made out of nylon, but you'll put those up about 4 weeks beforehand. It's going to block out the sunlight, which reduces the breakdown of L-theanine into different polyphenols like catechins. They apply that to the sencha processing, and they eventually come up with a new style of tea. And so Yamamoto-ya comes up with their own form in 1835. Another guy, Eguchi Shigejuro, comes up with the form in 1841 and calls it gyokuro. And if you haven't had gyokuro, to explain it, it's a Japanese green tea like sencha, but it has a much richer, stronger umami flavor. And often very high quality versions will be hand harvested. So it's usually a very expensive tea in a company's portfolio. And we're getting close to the end of the slides here. So I want to thank you guys for sticking through history and making it to modern day tea. This is just some pictures that I took in Ujitowara to kind of show you. On the left picture, you can see on the very left side, we have green rows of tea bushes. On the right side, you can see where the tea bushes have actually been covered by this black nylon cloth. I don't know if that tea was going to become gyokuro, maybe it would become kabuse-cha or another kind of shaded tea. But you can kind of see in the right picture as well what it looks like when you're under this shading. And in Japanese, it's called oika saibai. So it's basically shaded cultivation. We'll go to the next slide. And I just wanted to talk to you really briefly about the scale of tea in Japan. So this slide just kind of shows you some of the tea growing areas in Japan. So, a little bit in Honshu, a lot more in Kyushu. Shikoku is the #1 tea growing prefecture in Japan, followed pretty closely by Kagoshima. It changes a little bit year to year, and this map actually I think is from 2010. But Japan creates approximately 100,000 tons of tea per year. It's been less and less over the past couple of years. To put it in perspective, China makes about 2.77 million metric tons of tea per year. So almost 30 times what Japan makes. So Japan is a relatively small tea producing country. And, actually the Japanese tea industry has been kind of hurting over the past couple of years. Tea consumption by young Japanese people is pretty low. And a lot of tea has been produced to make ready to drink bottled beverages because that's a more popular consumption method recently. So for those of you in Japan, drink green tea, support your tea farmers. And we'll go to the next slide. And to really quickly talk you through how tea is made, it will be either shaded or unshaded, as I've showed you before. Picked, it'll go through a withering process. And so basically what that does is reduce moisture in the tea. It'll go through a kill green. What this is basically it'll be heated to a high enough temperature to stop enzymes that would oxidize the tea and turn it into something else, like a black tea. So if we destroy those enzymes, we'll keep the tea green. It'll be rolled or shaped. Often for green tea, there's not a ton of rolling that goes into it, but there'll be some shaping, dried and packaged. And that's a very generalized format for how tea is grown and processed. And if you want to go to the next slide. I have a little bit more detail on this slide, and I'm not going to go through all of it, but the processes that I just said basically would be for your aracha or your roughed tea. Aracha is usually purchased by a lot of the big tea companies in Japan. They will then blend that rough tea from the farmer with some other teas from other farms. They'll make kind of their own recipe or their own unique flavor profile that they're known for. And then they might also fire it again to kind of harmonize the flavor of those teas from different farms. And just a little bit of facts. So sencha is 80% of what is produced in Japan. As mentioned before, gyokuro is grown with shade. Sencha is grown directly in the sun, so no shading. It'll be basically, steamed. And while you're steaming, you create a lot of byproducts. So a lot of things are broken from steaming. And so sencha also has a really cool upcycling angle where, like, even if you break the leaves, you can make kuki-cha or stem tea, or you can make kona-cha or mei tea, which is mei-cha, which is like powdered tea. So Japan has awesome waste streams built into the production of sencha, so it's upcycled really well. And then just to give you some information on cultivars, Yabukita is the most popular cultivar. It's about 70% of what's grown in Japan. And if you just go buy sencha from the store, it's probably what you're getting. After that, Yutaka Midori is pretty famous. Other areas like southern Japan has some different cultivars that are more widely used. Basically, different cultivars have different disease tolerances, different frost tolerances. They do better in different areas, but Yabukita is pretty well adapted to almost all of Japan. It's about 90% of what's grown in Shizuoka, and that's where most of Japanese tea is grown. So that's why it accounts for most of Japan's tea. And I don't think there's too many more slides. There might be one more. So this is just a cool graphic. Just wanted to show you. So I mentioned sencha is steamed. There's a degree of steaming that can occur. So we have on the left, basically asamushi, which is a light steaming, going all the way to the right, which is like a fukamushi, or sometimes you have like a, tokubetsu fukamushi. So these different levels of steaming. So from the left, we're going from low steam to high steam. What that means is the leaf will be exposed for either a shorter or a longer period of time to the steam. The longer you steam a tea, the more broken it's going to become. But also a lot of those compounds, like the catechins that make it astringent or bitter, those will be basically denatured or destroyed. And so your fukamushi, your deep steaming tea, your sencha, will be a lot more full-bodied and rich and a lot less bitter than your asamushi or your light steaming. And you can even see from the picture some of the difference in color, which I really like. And we'll go on to the next slide. And I think I talked a pretty good amount about Gyokuro here. If anyone has more questions about it later, you can ask me specific questions, but I think I kind of already talked through it. So I think that's the last one. Yes, so I just have some sources here, maybe some good books if you want to read stuff. But yeah, I want to thank you guys for sitting through what was a lot of history with a little bit of tea. And we can take some questions now if there's time.
Yeah, there's definitely time for questions. So I know we had a couple during during the registration process. And so one of them was here. Pull that up again. Oh, you might have had that. I think I would pass that off to you, Pat. There was a question about how you can tell if a tea is what it says it is, if there's a way you can discern quality and avoid those sort of fake teas that we were mentioning before.
So it's a very good question. The easiest way to learn the quality of a tea is to drink a lot of tea. I know it kind of sounds like I'm avoiding the question, but I would recommend that if you're trying to learn about the quality of tea, first start with vendors that you trust. And I can recommend, some good vendors to buy tea from. So you want to start with people who sell good tea. If you're starting with good shops, good vendors, you'll know what you're buying is at least a certain level of quality. From there, it's about drinking a lot of tea. So you have to drink and try a lot of teas to understand the range and complexity of those teas. But you can't just drink tea, like knock it back. You have to really focus on it, understand what was unique about the tea that you bought and that you're drinking, and what really defines some of the properties of it. So, if you're drinking sencha, right? If you're drinking Japanese sencha, you should focus on where did it come from, right? So if I'm drinking a sencha from Shizuoka, you want to try many of them so you can understand the taste of Shizuoka. From there, you can compare it to maybe Kagoshima sencha, or maybe sencha from like Uji or Kyoto, right? And over time, you want to have those references built. So as you're tasting these teas, it's not just about tasting it, but then mentally comparing it to the framework of teas that you've had. And so it's like to give reference for like my job, right? Not currently, but when I was a tea quality specialist for Tivana, I would be drinking something like 300 teas a day. And obviously that like destroys your palate, right? You're really tired at the end of the day, you're not tasting anything. But what that does is it gives you a really good frame of reference for specific products. So I would drink like 40 Ceylon teas a day. and I would know Ceylon pretty well by the end of the day and by the end of working like that. But at the beginning of my tea journey, I probably had about 2,000, 3,000 unique teas within about 4 years. So I would say start by drinking a lot of tea from vendors that you trust. There is inherent qualities of tea that you will learn to gravitate towards, such as the mouthfeel of a tea, the basically lingering sweetness that a tea creates, as well as how it affects your body. So, you know, high quality tea will usually feel very comfortable when you drink it. Your throat will feel like very open. You won't feel any tightness in like your temples, your cheeks. So it should feel very open and soft and comfortable to drink. If you drink a tea and it makes you feel like weird, anxious, tight in your jaws or your temples, if it gives you a headache, that's a good sign that the tea is probably not so good, and maybe you just throw it out, or you know, give it to someone you don't like, right? Give it to your worst enemy. But you know, really, my recommendation would be if you want to learn about tea, of course, study, right? Read books and all that, but it really comes down to drinking tea and focusing on what you're drinking, and trying to learn from it, not just knocking back a mug, right? So that's the long answer for that question, but it's a very good question. I think a lot of people often ask that when they're first trying to get into tea. How do I know what's good? I would also supplement that by saying, also focus on what you like, because just because something's good doesn't mean you like it. So, you know, you don't have to become a tea expert, but maybe find what you enjoy and drink that a lot and just focus on that and learn more about that before maybe you venture out into things that you don't care about as much.
Great, thank you. We have another question in the chat. If you travel to Japan, where would you recommend going for tea, as in a tea house, cafe, restaurants, etc.?
I have a great one for you right in Tokyo. It's called Sakurai Tea Experience. It is amazing. The owner really knows his tea, really good connection with farmers. They roast their own hojicha in-house, and it's really good. But his hand-picked gyokuro and his hand-picked sencha are otherworldly. They're a little expensive, but they're otherworldly. So I definitely start there. Chachanoma in Omotesando is great too. They have some really good food as well. Very different aesthetics, different vibes to those places. But I would say start with Sakurai. Expect to spend like, you know, a good amount of money to try their best teas. I think like their high-end stuff is like $30 or $40 to sit there and drink it. But even their lower end stuff, which is like, you know, could be like $3 to $10, like going to a Starbucks. Even that stuff is still really good and will give you a good introduction to Japanese tea, as well as some cool brewing methodologies, because they'll brew in front of you as well.
And we have another question here. Do tea leaves have an expiration date?
Yes and no. So green tea, I would say yes. I have had examples that fly in the face of that. So one of my tea teachers based in Taiwan, he aged Dragonwell. It's a Chinese green tea. He aged that for 40 years in a pewter jar, and it tasted amazing. It was otherworldly. But in general, most green teas will be best within their first 3 months of production. You can still drink them after that, and they'll definitely be fine for a year. I would say green tea after about a year really loses its quality pretty fast. For other things like black tea, I would say about 2 years. But a lot of it comes down to the quality of the tea. So if it's extremely high quality tea, usually it will improve with age if you put it in correct storage conditions. If it's low quality tea, it's just going to get worse with age. So it's kind of like garbage in, garbage out, treasure in, maybe treasure out. So a little bit of a complicated answer, yes and no.
Thank you for these questions. If you have more, please do send them in the chat, or feel free to even unmute yourself to ask directly. I also wanted to share a few of the other tea resources that Pat wanted to share. We can send this in the email out afterwards as well. But here are some tea vendors, including the two that I shared earlier. So feel free to save these, or like I said, we can send them to you afterwards. We have another question. So it sounds like matcha is most popular tea in the US for Japanese tea. Could you tell me why Americans like matcha? Did matcha sweets influence that trend? And what kind of teas will be popular in US in the future? Or what do you expect will be popular in the US?
So I think the question had a little bit of the answer in it, but yes, certainly sweets and matcha being used as an ingredient in like foods or in drinks, and not the focus of it, is what really helped matcha become popular in the US. So things like, matcha frappuccino, matcha lattes at Starbucks, right? Like, not to plug my own company, but those things definitely broke the ground a little bit for US consumers. I think it took a lot longer. I would say it really took probably 5 to 10 years of matcha being used as an ingredient before matcha as a beverage itself, like by itself, became a little more acceptable to the American palate. I would still say even now, the general American mainstream consumer, while they know what matcha tastes like, I don't think it's like a favorite flavor in America, especially not the way it is in Japan. But I'd say in the future, as far as Japanese teas that will become popular in America, I think hojicha has a lot of room to become more popular. It's a roasty flavor. Americans are used to coffee as far as beverages go. So I think there's a lot of room for hojicha to become popular. One, I think matcha became popular also because of the health benefits. So hojicha has health benefits. It's also lower in caffeine because of the roasting and because it's usually uses older tea leaves, which have less caffeine. So I think hojicha is probably pretty primed to become very popular in the next 5 or 10 years. It has started to be used as an ingredient in the US in some kind of more exploratory restaurants, right? Like fine dining and that kind of stuff. So I think you'll see it become more mainstream, maybe 2025 or so.
Great, thank you for that question. Does anyone else, hang on. Why do you think sweetened tea is so common in the US, but not so much in Japan?
So the US has a very interesting history of tea, and it could probably be its own complete series. But basically, our sordid history with tea doesn't just start with like the Boston Tea Party. We do have a love affair with tea even before that, but American consumers were mostly actually buying green tea. When you go back to basically the 1700s and even the late 1600s, we're mostly consuming green tea, mostly from China. Green tea got a really bad rap. A lot of vendors at that time started mixing in a lot of things with the green tea to cut the costs. Some of that included like goat poop, no joke, supposedly is green, I don't know. But also some pretty poisonous compounds, some different magnesium-based compounds that are green in color to brighten up the color of the tea. And so because the tea was so heavily adulterated, American consumers started to prefer black tea. And this also happens in Europe as well. So you have the Western palate shifting towards black tea because they believe it's harder to adulterate that product. But then tea really becomes popular in the US, not so much until the late 1800s. We have enough time to forget about the Boston Tea Party, but really it becomes popular thanks to refrigeration, more as we move into the 20th century, because you have a lot of people creating basically tea punches. So tea with alcohol as a way to cool off becomes really popular. And when you're mixing something bitter like tea with alcohol, which is also bitter, you usually need a lot of sugar to offset that. So really iced teas and alcoholic tea is really what helped the spread of tea in the US. And I think that stuck. Even when we took the alcohol out of it, I think sweet tea was still here to stay. That's kind of what consumers got used to. And I really don't think other than coffee, in the normal American diet, I don't think there's a lot of bitter things that we consume. And even coffee, usually people are getting their frappuccinos and stuff with lots of sugar in it. So I think Japanese people are more used to bitter flavors and they like it, or even think that bitter things are healthy versus American consumers, which go like, oh, it's bitter, why would I drink it? So I don't know if I answered the whole question, but.
Thank you. We don't have much time left. We do have one last quick question. Of the links above that we had shared, which vendor would you say has the best Tamario? And also, how do you determine if they have steamed or pan-fried it?
So Tamario, just for everyone's reference, is a pan-fried Japanese green tea. Often it'll have a really interesting shape. That's where the name comes from. Tama means like a ball or a circle. It actually is much more similar in flavor to some Chinese pan-fried green teas. From the vendors I put on the list, I'm trying to remember which one would have the best Tamario. I would say if you're in Japan, the Chachanoma or Sakurai are your best bets. If you're not in Japan, I don't think it's on the list, but there's a company called the Tea Crane that has a really good Tamario cha. And also there's actually a French company that has really good Japanese tea called Thés du Japon, or like it's basically Teas of Japan in French. They have a really good Tamario cha as well. Most of the vendors I put on the list actually specialize in Chinese tea. That's, as I said, that's really my specialty as well. But hopefully between the ones I just said, you can find a tea you're looking for. And what was the second part of that question?
The second part, how can you tell if they have steamed or pan-fried it?
So usually you can tell from the look of the leaves. So pan-fired tea is going to be much more intact. So it'll be much more of a whole leaf. Steamed tea gets, basically in the processing, it gets pressed and flattened and it looks just like a needle. It's very thin. If you just lift one leaf, it just looks like a straight needle. Whereas your pan-fired tea isn't going to have that really flat, heavy shaping. But the aroma will really tell you as well. So pan-fired tea will have a really roasty, not really roasty, but it'll have a toasty kind of floral aroma to it. Maybe it'll smell a little bit like bread or nuts. Whereas your steamed tea really smells very vegetal. So most Japanese tea, most sencha is steamed. And so if you have sencha as your frame of reference, that's almost all sencha is steamed. So if you just look at a normal sencha tea, that's a good frame of reference for steamed. Look at a Chinese green tea, that's a good reference for pan-fired.
Great, thank you. So unfortunately, that is all the time we have for questions. And so thank you, everyone. I'm going to pass this over to Gabe and Yume for a moment before we wrap up today. So thank you.
Well, everyone, please join me one more time in thanking Patrick Penny for speaking with us about tea so much this evening. My head is full of tea leaves right now. I feel like I haven't talked that much about tea in a very long time, although I think it was just a couple hours since you talked about tea this much, if I understand correctly. So no, it's I can't imagine a better speaker to come speak with us about tea today. So thank you very much, Pat. I also wanted to say we have a couple of people I want to give shout outs to here. We actually have two of our program participants joining us, Yoko Watanabe and Yuki Yoshida from our Joy program. Thank you very much for joining us this evening. Nice to see you here. And also one of our main partners in our programming is Japan Foundation. And we have a representative of Japan Foundation Los Angeles, Mr. Mike Penny, joining us today too. So thank you very much for joining us, Mike. Evidently our speaker,
unrelated
Patrick
to
Penny's, yeah, long lost cousins, I guess. I also, just a moment before we get to the door prize, I know everybody's hoping they can get the tea. Please bear with me for just a second. I want to put a couple of links here in the chat. First of all, to our website, laurasian.org, and then a couple of our program Instagram pages. Those are good places to see updates, latest updates on any events that we have going on, things like that. And then also my personal LinkedIn page, if you'd like to get in touch with me about other Japan-related programming or other things that you would like to see Laurasian doing. We're always open to collaborations and love to communicate with you. So please feel free to reach out to me. I also wanted to let you know, we'll follow up with an email after this event, giving some of those links. You'll also see a link to our website that's got a donate button. We are a nonprofit group. Every little bit helps. So if you want to throw us a couple of dollars, if you thought the programming was quality today, please feel free. Finally, I wanted to mention that our next event will be in mid-January. Please watch for that on our social media accounts. We'll have that officially announced soon. I can tell you the topic will be covering Japanese cinema next time. It's going to be an academic analysis of how Makoto Shinkai has taken influence from Hayao Miyazaki in many ways, some obvious, some not so obvious, to become the popular face of Japanese animation internationally. And also how Kimetsu no Yaiba might be coming up to challenge that as well. So if anybody's interested in Japanese animation, please feel free to join our next event in January. Now, without any further ado, we're going to move on to the door prize. Yume, please take it away.
Yeah, first of all, thank you, Pat, for the amazing presentations. I'm Japanese, but I've learned a lot, and it was so much fun. And I already checked the schedule of the what's that? The Tenmok Chawan. And then I couldn't see any exhibition right now in Tokyo, but it seems like there is one in January-ish, so I'll go check definitely. Anyways, so today's door prize, everyone who stayed until now, thank you so much. Some people left, so it has higher chance for you. So first door prize will be 特上緑茶, 特上蒸し緑茶. So, as Pat explained, like this is like a deeper steamed ryokucha, so it's gonna be bitter a little bit and a lighter smell from the list. I was just learned. So, and it has a little introduction even in English, so whoever doesn't have still learning how to drink tea, it will be helpful. So I have all the numbers here. Gabe, are you ready for the list?
I am ready. I've got my list with numbers.
So again, if someone has left already, it's going to be a next person. And that is 26. Number 26.
Number 26 is Misa Baum. Misa Baum, is she still with us?
She's here, yeah. Congratulations.
Yay.
Congratulations, Bam-san. We'll ship to you your home address. So we're going to email you separately. But please note that this is such a busy time because of the COVID and because of the Christmas season. The mail system is very slow. So please expect that it will take time to get there. But we'll send to you and we'll email you. And today, for special, I have second prize, which is Sakura Ryokucha. It's a cherry blossom plus green tea in the tea bags. So that goes to number 11.
Number 11 is William Downey. William Downey, are you still with us?
Downey here? Oh no, I don't see the name.
I saw him earlier. I think he's gone now. William Downey.
Oh, too bad.
Darn it, I don't see him. Okay, next number.
Next person. It's number 24.
24 is Vivian Chen. Vivian Chen, are you still with us?
Here? No, I don't see the name.
I don't see her. Gotta stick around.
Chance to come to you. Now, number 5.
Number 5 is Su Ui. Su Ui?
Nope. I don't see
Nope.
it.
I don't see her either. All right. Your chances are getting better every time.
Going. Number 20.
Number 20. Number 20 is Sean O'Connell. Sean O'Connell?
O'Connell. No, I don't see.
Don't see him either.
Funny. Number 1 was easy. Number 2 is number 9. Q.
Number 9 is Alice DeYoungie. Alice DeYoungie. Nope.
How I picked these old people that are not here. Number 14.
Number 14. Number 14 is Douglas Wagner.
Oh,
Douglas,
I see his name.
Douglas Wagner. Oh, there he is. Okay, Douglas Wagner, you are our winner.
Congratulations.
Congratulations.
Close to you after many missing people. You're one. All right. Well, again, thank you so much, and then I'll mail it to you, and I will email you separately to get your home address. Thank you so much, and Gabe, back to you.
Okay, well, so I mean that brings us to the end of our show this evening. Unless Pat, you have any final words to send everybody off on?
Yeah, I was just going to say, for all of you who stuck around, thank you so much for listening in attentively and for providing, amazing questions. I think those were all really great questions. If anyone has any further questions, you can always reach out to me. I think my contact information maybe was in the slide, but if not, ppenny@starbucks.com is the way you can reach me. If not, you can find me on like Instagram or something like that, Facebook. Patrick Penny is my real name, not related to Mike Penny, but cool to see that. There's not so many other people with my name. But anyway, yeah, thank you guys very much for joining. And, hope you feel like you learned a little something about tea. And if you're interested in any further tea type lessons, maybe in the future, Laurasian can host something again. And we'll talk about another topic. So thank you guys.
And just because this popped up in the chat, yes, we will make this recording available on Laurasian's YouTube page. So perhaps we'll try to include that link when we email this to everybody out. So please watch for that soon. All right, that does it for us this evening. Everyone go have a nice cup of tea and enjoy the rest of your night. Thank you very much. Goodbye.
Thank you. Arigato. Bye-bye.